Brian is the executive director of Hyperledger and the Linux Foundation, and he's going to come up and talk to us about the use of blockchains in various social impact scenarios.
Hello. Thank you all for joining. So in order to talk about kind of the use of blockchain technology, and in particular this kind of enterprise side of blockchain technology, I wanted to really talk about kind of the arc of openness and the role of openness in technology over the last, really the last 20 years. A lot of us have this concept of innovation as something that happens as a spark, something that happens as an aha moment, that an innovator, perhaps it's through genius, perhaps it's through perspiration, as Thomas Edison famously put it, but arrives at some sort of invention, some sort of app, some sort of thing that then it's just a simple matter of getting out into the world and getting adoption, right? And whether it's something as ubiquitously useful as the light bulb, actually the filament inside that, or as useless as a bicycle with tank treads, the typical model for rewarding that kind of innovation has tended to be a patent, right? An idea that there's a license from government, that you as the inventor have the exclusive right for 19 years, sometimes it's more or less, to go out and profit exclusively from that innovation, right? And this has been a driver, of course, of trillions of dollars of wealth generation, so much revenue, so much of the building of industry. We kind of take for granted, perhaps, we think perhaps that that's the only model for how invention and innovation go out and have an impact in the world. But there are some ways in which this model kind of lead us to a Tower of Babel, all right? It can lead us to a world where, and by the way, does anyone recognize what these are? These are, yes. Electric vehicle chargers, exactly. These are 3 different formats for CHAdeMO chargers, which are the higher capacity chargers for electric vehicles, the kind that could recharge a Tesla scale vehicle in about 2 hours. The problem is there's 3 different formats for them, which means if you have a non-Tesla car, actually I think one of these might be Tesla, when you pull up to a charger, your odds are 1 in 3 that it'll match, and 2 in 3 that it won't, right? And we end up sometimes in technology in a world where it's more than just beta versus VHS, it's more than just Coke versus Pepsi. We end up in this kind of Tower of Babel of too many choices and not enough simplicity for the end users and not enough integration. But underneath the covers, and perhaps in ways that aren't quite noticed, there's another side to the innovation story that really did start with the idea of open standards. Now, I could have shown the railroad gauges from the convergence around a certain width for railroads in the United States. I believe it was 4 foot 8 inches around the latter part of the 19th century. But even that, there's multiple standards out there. But what I've chosen to show you is the TCP/IP stack, what's called the OSI model for how the internet was built. This graphic illustrates another set of trillions of dollars of wealth creation. What this shows you is something that is the stack all the way from the underlying hardware, Ethernet cables plugging into servers and things, up to at the very top applications like the Google search engine, right? And the intervening layers of standards and definitions that allowed us to build an industry where there were companies that could build products and services at each layer that were interoperable with the layer below and with the layer above. And by setting these standards through open conversation, through standards forums like the Internet Engineering Task Force or other similar orgs where those standards were available under open licenses for companies to go and be able to deploy and researchers to be able to do tests with, and for everybody to build compatible products, we moved from a world that previously was about one company's kind of network versus another to a truly interoperable internet. And this has been the model that's carried us for the last 20 years in building these technologies. It hasn't really needed a lot of fine-tuning. Within each layer, there's been constant iteration. There's been patents. There's been places where companies have had one advantage over another. But this has been a vehicle that it's allowed us to build an entire internet industry. And this is not alone. When we think about other models for how innovation can have an impact out there in the world and solve real problems, I like to think about vaccinations, right? Vaccines, there was a tremendous amount of value in coming up with the polio vaccine, coming up with hepatitis vaccines, right? Like that invention, sure, that probably even deserved a patent protection and a tremendous reward for the team that arrived at it. But just coming up with that invention didn't lead to suddenly everybody being immunized, right? You had to go out and actually deliver those immunizations as projects. And that required not only a lot of engagement in the private sector and a lot of companies going and manufacturing vaccines, it required engagement with the public sector, with governments, and with, in some cases, even militaries, realizing that there was value in going out and delivering vaccinations and trying to eradicate diseases like polio from the face of the earth. We're actually very close to seeing the back end of polio in the world, which is a tremendous accomplishment. And we wouldn't have gotten there exclusively by the kind of traditional model of innovation as we know. So I want to tell a story really quickly about a place where open source software kind of carried that torch from the open standards world into a new domain and had an impact. In the mid-2000s, there was a recognition that there was a real need in the developing world to track the immunization projects and the immunizations of citizens through something better than a clipboard, something better than paper records sitting at clinics out in the field, that there was a need, especially to get a picture of, has everybody in the country been immunized, to go digital. But in countries like Rwanda and countries with very meager communications infrastructure or technology infrastructure, there wasn't a lot of tooling to be able to do this. There wasn't a tradition of digital tools at rural health clinics and the like. So a set of organizations led by Partners in Health and the Gates Foundation and the Reagan Street Institute funded an effort to build software that could run on very low-cost PCs that would sit at a clinic and be used to track it's the very simple information about the people coming in, getting their shots, when did they get it, and to call them back 6 months later to get a booster shot, right? And so OpenMRS was born. And OpenMRS is, again, this very simple software released as open source code. But this wasn't just software that was parachuted in and dropped into a rural clinic on a piece of hardware and left for the community to use and never get updated, never get supported. Or hey, if you have a problem, call a U.S. phone number to help support. None of that would have worked in that kind of model, right? What it required and what they did was trained local technologists, trained local youth, especially, who were really excited to learn about programming, excited to learn about technology, to not just support this software, but set up a business around providing support to these organizations, to the clinics that were using this technology. And because the software was open source, meaning they had the source code, they had the ability to modify it and get inside it, they could improve what the OpenMRS platform did to add new features. So over time, these kids, these local support organizations in the field in countries like Rwanda started to add support for prenatal health care, started to add support for other kinds of health services. And now OpenMRS has become a healthcare information management system for the full longitudinal health records for individuals. And this was done by a community of people working together, initially bootstrapped by a set of nonprofit organizations, but building not just a local capacity in country to understand how to use the technology, but a local commercial capacity as well to improve it and extend it. And Rwanda was a first kind of use case. It came in at a time when the country was rebuilding after some traumatic events in its history. But ever since then, the open MRS code has been used in over 40 different countries, including even in the United States, and is truly a success story of open software, open source code, having a social impact, and building upon open standards, building upon that whole trajectory of what came before. And the open source movement, perhaps we make some noise about it, perhaps it's hard to understand, but it really is this underlying bedrock of the technology industry. It's kind of quiet at times, but it has involvement from every single technology company on the planet. I mean, Microsoft, I see as a sponsor here, Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation a couple of years ago, which I think was the equivalent of a snowball making its way to hell in the minds of many. But really, it was something that you could see coming, because now even the most proprietary, so to speak, software company in the world recognized that there was a movement here. This was an efficient way to build software, an efficient way to move further, faster in the kinds of technologies that are non-differentiating, that are table stakes, that really require working together, and optimizing your spend on that so you can spend more money elsewhere, right? So you can spend more money on products and services that are actually truly differentiating. So this is very much about helping industry move along further and faster. So we have open standards that help glue together kind of how the internet works and how other technology movements work. We have open source code, which helps bootstrap companies, large and small, into these new domains and share code and get things done and have an impact that way. But most of the world isn't just about using code. Most of the world is about transactions. This was the domain that really hadn't yet been touched by open source software until right about 10 years ago, when a set of developers started thinking about how do we open the world of sending stores of value across the network? How do we think about the moving beyond how credit card companies work, how banks work, in these kind of traditional closed networks, into something that can be also more open and more transparent and more flat, more shareable. Because the traditional model of payment networks, the traditional model of other kinds of transaction networks, is something that really harkens back to the mainframe, right? Is really this concept of there's a big server sitting in a room somewhere, and everybody is feeding into it or pulling out from it, right? That's the model of Swift. That's the model which is all about messaging between banks, but still depending upon Swift fundamentally to kind of reconcile these transactions. It's the model of Visa or MasterCard or PayPal. And when you think about it, even the modern digitized types of transaction systems in the world, things like Uber, right, or PayPal, still fundamentally sit in that world of we're at the center of the universe. And that would be fine if institutions and companies like this were something that we all could trust. In fact, I think it's been said that the technology industry benefited from 30 years of the development of a reservoir of trust in technology companies that really over the last 10 years have been eroded. And it's trust in technology companies, it's trust in government, it's trust in other kinds of institutions. The Edelman Trust Barometer is something that some of you might be familiar with, which is a gigantic yearly survey that asks citizens of the world, what's your trust in government? What's your trust in lawyers? What's your trust in brands? What's your trust in technologies? And pretty much over the 25 years they've been running this survey, that trust has been collapsing, all right? For good reason, but also in ways that perhaps are gameable. And we see this perhaps very clearly in the recent testimony that Facebook was giving in government, where that trust, that anxiety, that anger in society has a pretty interesting reflection point in Mark Zuckerberg. But really, it's I think a reflection of the distrust that we've started to have in how the technology systems work, and whether they really work for us, work on our behalf, or trap us into silos and systems and rob us of our agency. So in this world, a lot of the technologists have recognized that maybe there's something we can bring from the open source world, from open standards world, and try to move what has been a re-centralized system, kind of like on the left, back to something that is re-decentralized, something that is redistributed in much the way that the original internet architectures allowed us to be, right? And that's what's been driving the blockchain industry for the last 10 years. It's what drove, arguably, Satoshi Nakamoto and the Bitcoin crowd were kind of, to push us at the extreme of this level. But I think for many people, there's a recognition that if we can build these types of cooperative information systems that don't require a Facebook or an Uber or a PayPal at the center of our systems, then maybe there's some value to this. Maybe this is something that's worth doing. Maybe if we make these kinds of networks look more like a souk, more like a marketplace, right? More like a vibrant, multi-stakeholder, multi-participant community, we'll do something right. And so what emerged out of this is a definition for blockchain technology that, everyone perhaps has their own. I'd like to share with you mine, which is that blockchain technology is really a decentralized system for recording events amongst a crowd in a trustworthy way, not having to depend upon somebody at the center, but all of us being able to work together on a trustworthy system of record for the things that go on in our community, the transactions that happen in our community. And secondly, it does that in a way that ensures that those events conform to a mutually agreeable set of rules, right? That, for example, if I transfer something to you and you transfer something to somebody else, that second transaction can't happen if the first one didn't, right? There are rules about how these things are allowed to operate. Once you have that kind of platform, then you can build things like currency systems like Bitcoin or a lot of the other things I want to talk about. So to get back to impact, I'm going to give a couple of really quick examples of where this technology is now being used, not only to create economic value and supplement and go and fix some of the business problems that exist out there in the world, but also have a positive social impact. And the first example I want to give is in the diamond industry, because the diamond industry cares quite a bit about provenance of its products, cares quite a bit that the diamond that you're looking at and being told is worth a fair bit of money is actually the same diamond that was pulled out of the ground from the place that it was claimed, that is not a fake diamond, that is not something that's been swapped out for something else. Not only because the quality and the size and all of that matter a tremendous amount, and these are all things that are defined in something called the Kimberley process, but also because there's been a tremendous amount of focus in the last 15 years on trying to eliminate slave labor and child labor from the supply chain in the diamond industry. And that would be easy if we had a really clear concept, of the few parties that were in the diamond sourcing, diamond transfer, and diamond supply business, but it ends up being a rather complicated supply chain space, right? So how do we keep track of this? How might consumers at the very end of that process, at the right hand, or the companies that sell diamonds to those consumers, how might they guarantee to their end users that this diamond is conflict mineral free, blood diamond free, that sort of thing? They can't really do it if all that they have to go on is the word of the companies that pass those diamonds through. What they need is a process, and what they need is a way of recording where, as these diamonds move through the system in a trustworthy way, what that series of handoffs were. So this is where a company called Hyperledger is building a blockchain, has built a blockchain-based system for implementing the Kimberley process that now supports about 15% of the world's diamond supply and helps reinforce the integrity of that system. In the food supply chain, there's a similar set of similar projects underway across all sorts of different products. You perhaps have heard of the Walmart Food Trust Network, which is tracing food and its supply. In fact, it's something that Carrefour, who's a participant on that network, has cited actually has led to increased revenue from consumers who feel more comfortable buying traceable product. And the food supply chain is one that's just as complicated and sophisticated as diamonds or any others, with lots of different parties involved. There's a company called ScanTrust that has implemented a blockchain like this for the coffee supply chain, where they put a QR code on a bag of coffee as it flows from where it's been sourced through to where it's roasted, through to the actual retail channel. And you, as an end consumer, can pull out an app, scan the QR code, and get a complete history, not only of its travels, but of the certifications that have been awarded to that product, and to the roaster, to the farm that it came from. You might even be able to get to know who is the farmer and the owner of the land that it came from itself. And this is all put together using blockchain technology and in a way that would not have worked if it had depended upon a central actor. In the plastics recycling business, there's a project called the Plastic Bank, which is creating an economic incentive for the recycling of plastic, for the collection of plastic, and the creation of recycled plastic goods that become luxury goods for consumers who know I'm buying this because it comes from recycled plastic. The traceability that built into that comes from the use of a blockchain network. Other projects in the electricity grid and other sorts of things. And the one that gets me most excited is the use of blockchain technology to reinvent how digital identity works. This might seem counterintuitive, but this is a mechanism that will allow us to move to a world that is actually much more intuitive to the way that you work with, the way that you think of your wallet, right? In your wallet, you have currencies, you have credit cards, but you also have perhaps a driver's license, perhaps not in your wallet, but in a filing cabinet, you have your diploma, you have a birth certificate. These are documents that you possess and can show to other people when you need them to be able to get a loan, to go apply for a job. And being able to prove the integrity of these documents requires a system very much unlike the mainframe type of model, but very much like a distributed ledger kind of model. And we've been helping work in this space with Hyperledger, building some underlying open source products to implement what's called self-sovereign identity, or kind of user-centric identity, again, using a distributed ledger to store the signatures and the keys and the hashes that allow us to get away from this kind of centralized identity world to something that's very distributed. And I think if you take any one of the SDGs, behind each of those SDGs is a metric, is a goal, is something that is in the world that you're trying to trace, right? That goes beyond the simple measure of GDP, goes beyond a simple measure of financial flow. And behind every one of those, I think there's a distributed ledger story, there's a blockchain story to try to go and tackle those. But that'll only work if we can get to trustworthy systems. Systems that have built into them the kinds of rules and the kinds of community enforcement that otherwise we need to depend upon central actors for. And the good news is that there's hundreds of these initiatives out there now using these technologies, starting to have an impact. And that's what we're working on. Thank you very much.